Welcome back to Reddit Whispers. The smell of lavender and old books. That was the scent of my mother's house, the scent of my entire childhood. It was the house my father had built, and after he passed, it became my mother Eleanor's sanctuary and my responsibility. My life for the 5 years after Dad's death had been a simple, unwavering orbit around her. Her mind, once a brilliant library of history and wit, had begun to fray at the edges, a cruel, slow unraveling called dementia. I became her memory, her anchor, her caregiver. My wife, Isabella, had seemed like a blessing in this difficult chapter. When we married, she had embraced my duty to my mother with a performance of such convincing compassion that I never thought to look beneath the surface. She would arrive at the house with flowers, sit with Mom for hours listening to the same repeated stories, and she would hold my hand at night, telling me I was a good son. She was beautiful, charming, and I believed utterly devoted. I missed the way her eyes would scan the room when she thought no one was looking, not at my mother, but at the solid oak furniture, the antique silver, the very bones of the house. I dismissed her questions about the will and the property deed as simple, pragmatic curiosity. I saw a caring partner. I was a fool who refused to see a predator. The call came on a Tuesday. My only aunt, my mother's sister, had suffered a massive stroke hundreds of miles away. My cousin was distraught, and I was the only family she had left to call. I had to go. The thought of leaving my mother, even for a few days, filled me with a gnawing anxiety. Isabella was the one who calmed me down. She insisted. She told me she would move into the house while I was gone, that she would take care of everything, that my mother wouldn't be alone for a single moment. She packed my bag, kissed me at the door, and told me to focus on my family because she had this under control. The gratitude I felt was immense. I left my world in her hands, never suspecting she intended to steal it. The trip was a grim 3-day vigil at a hospital bedside. On the 4th day, my aunt passed away. I spent another day helping my cousin with the initial heartbreaking arrangements. I called my mother's house every night. Isabella always answered, her voice a cheerful, reassuring melody. She would tell me Mom was doing great, that they had been gardening, that they had just finished a puzzle. She'd put my mother on the phone, and Eleanor would sound a little confused, as she often did, but she would tell me she loved me and that Isabella was a wonderful girl. I drove home through the night, exhausted by grief but eager to be back in the familiar comfort of my own life, to hold my wife and sit with my mother. I pulled onto the street just as the sun was rising, a pale, watery light filtering through the old oak trees. And then I saw it. A large, garish for sale sign hammered into the front lawn. My lawn. It was so jarring, so wrong, that for a moment I thought I was on the wrong street, that grief had scrambled my senses. But there was the crooked porch swing my dad had hung, the rose bushes my mother fussed over. And there was the sign, a declaration of war I didn't yet understand. I stumbled out of the car, my heart hammering against my ribs. The house was silent. The front door was locked. I used my key, my hand trembling so badly it took 3 tries to get it in the lock. The house was empty. Not just empty of people, but empty, stripped. The antique clock from the mantelpiece was gone. The family photos on the wall were gone. My father's favorite armchair was gone. A cold, methodical plunder had taken place. Panic, raw and acidic, rose in my throat. I ran through the house, calling my mother's name, my wife's name. The silence that answered was absolute. I found a note on the kitchen counter, weighted down by a single, perfect rose in a bud vase. It was Isabella's handwriting, a cruel, elegant script. It was a letter of justification, not apology. She wrote that she had cared for my mother, had sacrificed her own life to support mine, and that she deserved compensation. She said my mother had agreed that the house was a burden and that this was for the best. She wrote that my mother was safe, in a place where she could get professional care. She closed the letter by saying her lawyer would be in touch regarding the divorce. At the bottom of the page was the name of a facility, Lakeside Meadows Care Home. I had never heard of it. I drove there in a blind haze, the world outside my windshield a meaningless blur. Lakeside Meadows was not the idyllic place its name suggested. It was a grim, concrete block of a building on the industrial edge of town, reeking of bleach and despair. I found my mother in a crowded ward, tied to a vinyl chair. Her beautiful silver hair was matted, her eyes wide with a terror and confusion that shattered what was left of my heart. She was wearing a paper-thin gown that wasn't hers. She saw me and started to cry, a lost, whimpering sound. She tried to tell me what had happened, her story a tangled mess of fear and manipulation. Isabella had been so kind at first, she said. Then she had brought a man with papers. She had told my mother that I was in trouble, that signing the papers was the only way to protect the house for me. She had said it was a formality, a way for Isabella to help manage things. My mother, in her fog of dementia, trusted her. She signed the will, she signed the power of attorney, she signed everything. The very next day, 2 men had come and taken her here. They told her I had arranged it. She thought I had abandoned her. I held her, this tiny, frail woman who was the center of my universe, and I made a promise. I whispered it into her matted hair, a vow made in the heart of that hellhole. I would get her out. I would fix this. I would burn Isabella's world to the ground if I had to. I walked out of that facility not as a son, but as a soldier. My grief for my aunt was eclipsed by a cold, pure rage. I had lost my mother's home, my inheritance, and my wife in the span of a few days. But the only thing that mattered was the woman I had left tied to a chair. The war had begun. The first casualty of that war was my life as I knew it. Everything was stripped away, leaving only the singular, burning mission to save my mother. I was technically homeless. The house was already listed, the locks had been changed, and Isabella's lawyer sent me a formal notice of trespassing when I tried to go back for my personal belongings. I moved onto the couch of a sympathetic friend, my entire existence crammed into 2 duffel bags. My old life, my job as a graphic designer, my friends, my hobbies, they all faded into an unaffordable background noise. My world shrank to the size of my mother's new horrific reality. Lakeside Meadows was a warehouse for the dying. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and institutional food. The staff were either ghosts themselves, worn down to a nub by overwork and underpay, or they were callous, their compassion eroded by the sheer scale of the misery around them. Every visit was a fresh horror. I would find my mother in soiled clothes, or with bruises on her arms from rough handling, or simply alone, staring at a blank wall, her spark dimming a little more each day. She was declining rapidly in that environment, the neglect and loneliness accelerating the cruel work of her disease. My first priority was getting her out. I began researching other facilities, places with clean rooms and kind nurses, places that cost a fortune. My salary as a graphic designer was a drop in the ocean. So I started taking on more work, any work. I quit my stable 9-to-5 job and went completely freelance, working from my friend's cramped kitchen table. I designed logos, websites, and brochures from dawn until dusk. When the design work dried up, I took a job delivering pizzas at night. My car, once a vessel for weekend trips, became a mobile office and a source of income, smelling perpetually of pepperoni and cardboard. Sleep became a luxury. My diet consisted of coffee and whatever was cheap. I was a machine fueled by caffeine, rage, and a desperate, all-consuming love. I funneled every single dollar I earned into a separate bank account, an escape fund for my mother. Simultaneously, I began the legal fight. I found a young, hungry lawyer named David who specialized in elder law. He was outraged by my story and agreed to take the case on a contingency basis, meaning he wouldn't get paid unless we won. He was honest about our chances. Proving undue influence over a person with dementia was a legal minefield. Isabella had been clever. She had a notary and a witness, both of whom would testify that my mother had seemed lucid and willing. The legal battle was a slow, grinding war of attrition. Isabella's lawyer was a shark, filing endless motions, requesting mountains of paperwork, all designed to bleed me dry emotionally and financially. I would spend my days in a haze of work and my nights reading legal documents, my eyes burning from the screen's glare. The little money I had for myself went towards filing fees and document requests. All the while, Isabella was living her new life. Mutual friends who had quickly taken my side would reluctantly pass on information. She had sold the house quickly for less than it was worth to get the cash. She was posting photos on social media of lavish vacations, designer clothes, and expensive dinners. She was flaunting the money she had stolen, the money that was the bricks and mortar of my childhood home. Each picture was a fresh stab of the knife, but it also hardened my resolve. It made the 18-hour days and the cold pizza dinners feel like training for a battle I could not afford to lose. After 6 months of this relentless grind, I had enough for a deposit and the first month's fee at a better facility. It wasn't luxurious, but it was clean. It was called The Willows, and the staff smiled. They had a garden. The day I moved my mother out of Lakeside Meadows was the first victory in the war. I signed the discharge papers with a hand that shook with triumph. I bundled my mother, who was now so frail she barely weighed anything, into my car. As we drove away, I didn't look back. Arriving at the Willows was like watching a wilted flower get water. The change in her was almost immediate. The nurses treated her with dignity. They called her Eleanor, not the lady in 3B. They helped her with her hair, found her clothes that fit, and talked to her, even when her responses were confused. Her terror-filled eyes began to soften. She started to smile again, fleeting, beautiful smiles that were worth more to me than all the money from the house. I would visit her every day after my work, sitting with her in the small, tidy garden until the sun went down. She didn't always know who I was. Sometimes she would call me by my father's name. But she knew she was safe. And in those moments, as she held my hand, her grip surprisingly strong, I knew this fight was worth any price. My life was a hollowed-out shell, but I had my purpose. I had saved her from the darkness, and now I just had to find a way to make the person responsible pay for what she had done. The years that followed were a long, slow grind, a blur of work and worry, punctuated by the small, precious moments of peace I found with my mother. Life settled into a new, difficult rhythm. My days were a frantic juggling act of freelance design projects, my nights still often spent delivering pizzas. The two incomes barely weaving together to form the financial safety net that was the Willow's monthly fee. I moved from my friend's couch into a tiny studio apartment, a space just big enough for a bed, a desk, and a hot plate. It was a monk's cell, a place for sleeping and working, nothing more. My social life had vanished completely. I was a man in his 30s living the life of a pauper, driven by a single, all-consuming purpose. The legal battle with Isabella dragged on, a constant, low-level source of stress and expense. Her lawyers were masters of delay, and the case crawled through the court system at a glacial pace. Depositions, motions, discoveries, it was a war of 1,000 paper cuts. Yet I refused to give up. The fight was no longer just about the money or the house. It was a fight for my mother's dignity, a refusal to let Isabella's crime be the final word in our family story. It was at the Willows, in the quiet, sterile hallways that had become the backdrop to my life, that I met Chloe. She was a nurse, one of the few who worked the late shift. I would often arrive from my evening visit just as she was starting her rounds. She was quiet, observant, with a calm presence that seemed to soothe the anxious energy of the whole facility. She was different from the other staff. She took the time. I would see her sitting with residents who had no visitors, just holding their hand or reading to them from a newspaper. She saw my devotion to my mother, the exhaustion etched onto my face. Our first conversations were simple, professional. She would give me an update on my mother's day, how she had eaten, if she had been lucid. But gradually, our talks began to lengthen. She would ask me about my design work. I would ask her why she chose such a difficult, often thankless profession. I learned that she was a deeply compassionate person, drawn to caring for those the world had forgotten. She saw the good I was doing, not the failure I felt I was. She saw a devoted son, not a man who had lost everything. In a life that had become entirely transactional, a series of hours exchanged for dollars, her genuine interest in me as a person was a revelation. She started leaving a cup of coffee for me at the nurse's station when I arrived. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental. It was a drop of kindness in my desert of a life. Our friendship grew slowly, cautiously. I was a man made of scar tissue, wary of letting anyone get close. Trust was a currency I no longer had. But Chloe was patient. She never pushed. She just offered a consistent, gentle presence. She became the person I could talk to about the frustrations of the court case, the small heartbreaks of my mother's fading memory, the crushing weight of it all. She would just listen, her eyes full of an understanding that went beyond words. It was she who encouraged me to find an outlet for myself, something that wasn't about work or my mother. I had always loved to draw, a skill that had led me into graphic design. On her suggestion, I bought a cheap sketchbook and started drawing the residents at the Willows. I drew their wrinkled hands, their faraway eyes, the stories etched on their faces. It was a way to process the grief and beauty of the place, and it reawakened a part of myself I thought was long dead. One evening, after a particularly draining meeting with my lawyer, I arrived at the Willows feeling utterly defeated. Chloe found me in the garden, staring blankly at the rose bushes. She sat beside me in silence for a long time. Then she simply reached out and put her hand on my arm. It was the first time a woman had touched me with simple human affection in years. The wall I had built around myself cracked. I told her everything, the whole ugly story, the words pouring out of me in a torrent of pain and anger I had held inside for so long. She didn't flinch. She just listened. When I was done, she didn't offer platitudes. She just said, "You are a good man, Alex." In that moment, something shifted. My lonely fight felt a little less lonely. The case finally had a breakthrough when a former neighbor of my mother's, who had since moved away, was tracked down by my lawyer. She testified that she had seen Isabella's car at the house frequently in the weeks leading up to my trip, and had overheard Isabella on the phone once, laughing about how my mother was losing it and would sign anything. It was a small crack in Isabella's defense, but it was enough to convince the judge to let the case proceed to trial. Then, just as this small victory gave me a glimmer of hope, my mother's health took a sharp decline. Her body, which had held on for so long, finally began to give out. Chloe was the one who called me, her voice gentle, telling me I needed to come. I spent the last 2 days of my mother's life by her bedside, holding her hand, whispering the stories of her own life back to her. She passed away peacefully, in a clean bed, in a place where she was cared for with dignity. My promise was fulfilled. The grief was immense, a hollow, aching void. But as I walked out of the Willows for the last time, holding a small box of her belongings, I felt something else too. A quiet, unyielding strength. My fight for her was over. Now, the fight for her justice would begin. Chloe met me outside, and without a word, she took my hand, and we walked out into the world together. My mother's passing changed the nature of the fight. It was no longer about providing for her care. It was about honoring her memory. The lawsuit became a crusade for her name, a final act of filial devotion. The small amount of money my mother had managed to keep in a separate account, which she left to me, was just enough to fund the final, most expensive phase of the legal battle. I told David, my lawyer, to use all of it. I wanted to see it through to the end, regardless of the financial outcome for me. My life, however, was beginning to rebuild itself around the giant hole my mother had left. Chloe was the architect of that reconstruction. Our shared grief over my mother's death forged our bond into something stronger. We moved from friendship into love so naturally it felt inevitable. She was the calm harbor to my storm-tossed life. With her, I learned to trust again, to laugh again, to believe that I was deserving of happiness. We took the plunge and moved in together, into a small but bright apartment that felt like a world away from my previous monastic existence. For the first time in years, I had a home. My work evolved as well. The sketchbook I had started at the Willows became a portfolio. I found a passion not just for commercial design, but for portraiture. I started taking commissions, drawing people, capturing their essence in charcoal and pencil. It was more fulfilling than any logo I had ever designed, and it connected me to the world in a way I had thought was lost to me. I was still working tirelessly, but now it was not just out of grim necessity, but with a sense of purpose and even joy. I was building a future with Chloe, a life where my past was a part of my story, but not its defining chapter. The trial was set for a cold week in November, almost 4 years after I had first walked into David's office. Seeing Isabella across the courtroom was a surreal experience. She looked harder, older. The money had clearly run out some time ago. Her clothes were an echo of the designer brands she once flaunted, now worn and slightly frayed. The confidence had been replaced by a brittle, defensive anger. She sat next to her expensive lawyer, looking like a cornered animal. The trial was grueling. Her lawyer painted me as a neglectful son who was angry about being cut out of his inheritance. He portrayed Isabella as a saintly, overburdened caregiver who deserved compensation for her sacrifices. They brought their witnesses, the notary, the friend, who all testified that my mother was sharp and clear-headed on the day she signed the will. But then David put my witnesses on the stand. The neighbor, whose testimony was damning. A nurse from Lakeside Meadows who testified under oath about the facility's deplorable conditions and the suspicious nature of my mother's sudden admission. And most powerfully, Chloe. She spoke not as my partner, but as a medical professional, describing the typical progression of dementia and how easily a person in my mother's state could be manipulated by someone they trusted. She spoke with a calm, clinical authority that was unshakable. When it was my turn to testify, I didn't speak with rage. I simply told the story. I talked about my mother, about her love for her home, about her fear and confusion. I described the smell of Lakeside Meadows and the light in my mother's eyes when I moved her to the Willows. I wasn't just talking to the judge. I was speaking for my mother, giving her the voice that had been stolen from her. The verdict came 2 days later. The judge ruled in my favor. He found that Isabella had exerted clear and malicious undue influence, and that the will and the transfer of property were fraudulent. The victory was overwhelming. I broke down in tears in the courtroom, the weight of 4 years of fighting finally crashing down on me. I had done it. I had cleared her name. The financial reality, however, was grim. The judgment awarded me the full value of the house at the time of its sale. But, as David had warned, winning a judgment and collecting it are 2 different things. Isabella had spent everything. The vacations, the clothes, the high life, it had all been a temporary illusion. She declared bankruptcy a week after the verdict. The house was long gone, sold to an innocent third party. After all the legal fees, I ended up with almost nothing. But it didn't matter. The money was never the point. The victory was in the truth being brought to light. It was in the legal record forever that she was a thief and a manipulator, and that my mother was her victim. That was my inheritance. With the case finally over, a profound peace settled over me. Chloe and I got married the following spring. We saved enough to buy a small house of our own, with a little garden where we planted lavender in my mother's memory. My portrait business took off, and I was able to build a life not of wealth, but of meaning and contentment. We had a daughter, and we named her Eleanor. Years passed. Life became a beautiful tapestry of family, art, and love. The past was a closed book. Then, one rainy evening, there was a knock on the door. I opened it to find a ghost on my doorstep. It was Isabella. She was a ruin of the woman she had once been. Her hair was thin and gray, her face a roadmap of hard living. She was skeletal, wrapped in a threadbare coat that did little to ward off the chill. She looked at me, her eyes hollow, and started to speak. It was a rambling, pathetic monologue of regret and self-pity. She told me she was sick, that she was homeless, that she had nowhere else to go. She was begging, not just for money, but for a place to stay, for some kind of absolution. I looked at this woman, the architect of my deepest pain, and I felt nothing. No anger, no pity, no desire for revenge. She was just a pathetic, empty stranger. The great monster of my past had shrunk into this. I didn't invite her in. I didn't give her the satisfaction of a lecture or a tirade. I simply turned back into my house for a moment, wrote down the address of a local women's shelter and the number for social services on a slip of paper, and walked back to the door. I handed it to her without a word. Her hand, thin and cold, brushed mine as she took it. She looked from the paper to my face, her mouth opening to say something, but I had already started to close the door. I shut it softly, turned the lock, and leaned against the solid wood. I could hear the sound of my daughter's laughter from the living room, where Chloe was reading her a story. I was home. I was safe. And I was free. I had already won. Thanks for being here on Reddit Whispers. I've shared my story, but now I want to hear yours. What's the most surprising decision that turned everything around for you? Your comment could be the lifeline someone else is looking for today.